Today is the Center for Economic Strategy organized a discussion how to create trustworthy institutions in Ukraine. And now, after this debate, we are speaking to Peter Wagner, head of Ukraine support team at the European Commission, and Khatia Dekanoidze, who was the head of Ukrainian National Police for 2015 and 2016, about some issues that were not covered during the discussion, like that are the most important for the country right now, not only in the strategic perspective as what was discussed earlier. So my first question, and I will start from Khatia, is what are the key risks and challenges for Ukraine now? We see very low level of trust to all government institutions, to politicians, to opposition. What, in your opinion, is what government and civil society and general public should focus on now to prevent the further political, military or economic crisis?
Thank you very much for inviting, and thank you very much for being organizer of this wonderful discussion. I think it's great because we need to speak up about the problem which are very much important in the country. So key challenges, of course, they are the same: corruption, and all country, I mean, our citizens, civil society, even government, free media, we just have been talking about the corruption, to defeat corruption, but unfortunately still, just so-called internal demons, which we call corruption, is still in charge of everything, right? And if there is corruption, and if just ordinary citizen and ordinary civil servant sees that there is still a kind of redistribution of the authority and the financial resources in the government and in the people who are in charge of the reforms, then just ordinary citizens, they really don't trust the institutions which might be trusted, right? So corruption is a main challenge. Second is that not to risk of reversing the reforms which had been done, after Maidan. And especially I am very much frightened, and probably some of my colleagues and friends also, that after visa-free it can be done by somehow the the gambling situation, when we have visa-free right now and all reforms can be stopped, right? Or just doing nothing. And also I think the third main challenge, of course, which is very much important, is that to be under the threat of the external enemies, which is still strong and still occupying and trying to occupy occupying our territory. But actually, we had been always saying about the defeating inside enemies, but we have to realize and understand that we can defeat our external enemy if we will be able to defeat our internal enemies, right? So three main challenges, again, to sum it up: it's corruption, again, this state institutions that are not trusted by the people and government overall, and also not to risk and reverse backward the reforms after the visa-free regime, which is kind of huge destination for our country. When we can go inside in details, I mean, what kind of reforms is very much important for the country, but to run up the country is much important, right? I mean, to be very tough everywhere. But unfortunately, this government and the people who are in charge of changing country, they are not doing enough efforts.
Peter.
I think Khatia listed the main elements, and I would therefore would like to add one additional dimension, and that is this kind, what I would call double duality. What do I mean? you have the fact that Ukraine, you referred to it, is fighting at the external front and is at the same time fighting on the internal front with numerous reforms and fights against many people, enemies of progress achieved since Maidan. And that is, and the other dimension is that the external side is not seeing it as the Ukrainians do. The Ukrainians very much see the two conflicts, the internal and the external one, at a more or less equal level. From the outside, it is that people see mainly the internal conflicts with a very strong focus only on anti-corruption measures. Nobody looks at the enormous reform efforts and sometimes successes in areas such as procurement, the national bank, but of course forthcoming challenges like the pension and the health reform. And on the outside, everybody is ignoring the fact that Ukraine is a country that is suffering from external aggression. And I think this duality is a little bit a challenge because you're talking and perceived differently.
Yeah, and regarding the questions that was raised by Khatia on what to do after visa-free regime is granted by the European Union. Today there was a debate on whether this sandwich pressure between international partners and civil society should continue as the main trigger and driver of reforms, or should in fact Ukrainian politicians start doing their jobs and under the pressure of regular citizens do they work properly and conduct all needed reforms. Looking from experience of, for example, new member countries and the situation you see now in Ukraine, also you worked on Greece like another interesting case. Do you believe that there some tool is needed by the European Union and by the international other international partners that should serve as new external driver for Ukrainian reforms, or that those who defended today the idea that Ukrainians should be in charge are right?
Ukrainians are in charge of their reforms and have to be in charge of their reform. It's this famous ownership issue, and I'm deeply convinced there is a strong sense of ownership in the Ukrainian population. And there is a strong sense of ownership for reforms in the government and in politics, but not everywhere. And that momentum has to be kept up. Where I have my very strong doubts is these external elements. Ukraine will for a long time need and for sure receive support from its international partners as long as it is on the reform path. But generally speaking, I have very strong doubts that you can buy or force reforms from the outside. The IMF tranches, the macro-financial assistance of the EU, they are elements that help Ukraine to move on the reform path, but you will never get a reform only because it has been put into a memorandum of understanding. You have to have as a starting point something else. And that is where I think one should not forget and also not underestimate the moral dimension of what is going on in Ukraine, because it was not a revolution because of a shortage of cash flow. It was a revolution for certain values, for certain principles. And that is where I think the external side, the EU and others, definitely still have a role to play, because the people on Maidan and still nowadays see the EU as a benchmark, the way they want to live, the freedom they want to have. It's not a passport and the possibility to work abroad. It's the question of freedom and of belonging to a wider Western society that has been driving the people, and not just a bit of money or a passport as such.
In fact, Georgia was the only country in the region that achieved significant success in destroying the Soviet corrupt system without EU accession as the main trigger and driver of it. But it is the only case. Do you believe that Ukraine has a chance to do the same as Georgia did, or EU accession perspective is the only strategic perspective that should help Ukraine in the way to really get rid of Soviet system?
Well, each country has the preliminary requests and demands from EU before becoming the part of EU. And of course, if we admit that the huge success had been done in Georgia, it's true. It's true, and let me explain in a couple of words why this success was a true story and a true success story. First of all, because of the teamwork of the government, and because of the true political will that if we change everything. This is first. Second, Georgia was in the war too, just beginning from early 90s. The 25% of the territory of Georgia is still occupied by Russian Federation. And if you remember, in 2008, we had a huge, massive attack from Putin in Georgia. But despite the fact, Georgia just was the very good atmosphere for foreign investment and free of corruption, and the Georgian exchange rate, the national lari was very favorable. So it means that the political will was very broad, and the people in the government understood that to create the modern state country and a state as Georgia is very much important, right? Because when before the revolution of the Rose, when some foreign articles had been mentioning Georgia, they mentioned it like failed state, right? And after the revolution, we became the #1 country in the region which was free of corruption. And also the great success story was that the young generation did not know, and they still don't know, what is corruption and what is modern post-Soviet Georgia. So it's very much important. Unfortunately, in Ukraine, we don't have a generation which is not very much familiar with corruption and the situation which in the state's institutions. I think that we have a chance. Ukraine. I can admit that we missed a lot of opportunities and time after Maidan, because as Peter mentioned, what was Maidan about? Maidan was about the dignity of the people, right? And dignity and the values which are very much important for Ukrainian people. Values that we must be free, we must be the part of Europe, we must be the people which will not be under Putin, under Russian Federation, and we must be the people which understand what is a free world and the real world in the situation. So, and if you say that the corruption in the country does not necessarily mean that the people are okay with the values, of course not, because of course it touches the dignity of the Ukrainian people also. So I think that the chances still exist, but look at the people. Nobody is getting richer in this country. People are getting poorer, and that's a number one statistics that we have to admit, and the government must look at it. And also the one person at the conference panel discussion had mentioned the immigration problem. Yes, young people immigrated, and they still are continuing to leave the country because they are looking for the better efforts and opportunities, right? So we must be very, very attractive for our own generation, our own citizen, right? So I think that the chances, and these chances must be defended by the civil society, free media, which is unfortunately the shrinking in its size, and young generation, and not to give the opportunity to the oligarchs to be covered and to cover everything and to see the kind of frustration that nothing will be changed and it's our ideology, it's our mentality. No, No, because Ukrainian people didn't know corruption for a while, right? And our mentality is like that we're free people. So I think that if we can fight in this direction.
Thank you. So Peter, the last question. On one side, like from the experience of new member states that came through the accession process. On another side, like looking from the current situation in Ukraine, like what tools could be used by the European Union to help in democratization of Ukraine and building these trustworthy institutions?
What is very important is what I think we have now done with the delivery on the visa liberalization and the DCFTA association agreement, that we also deliver on our promises and that we confirm that we are and prove that we are reliable partners. That's a very first important issue, the pacta sunt servanda. Secondly, I think there is still an enormous readiness to support Ukraine, and there is the impression that it is not necessarily an issue of money. Many of the things the EU makes available annually, around 200 million euro, just for the reform support. With that you can run a lot of reform support projects. The macroeconomic situation has improved. Now it is important that this money is used strategically, and that is where on the one hand the wider economic and legal situation has to allow that business can develop, because then the EU can come in with a whole set of, be they called in pre-enlargement, be they called whatever, but they are financial instruments, guaranteeing microcredits, loans, which can come in, for which the money would be available and which would help stimulate the economy. But none of these instruments makes a lot of sense in an environment of legal uncertainty where everybody has to fear corporate raiding. Thirdly, it's very important that the EU remains a kind of a benchmark on this value dimension, that the people also see the EU as a partner in the fight for certain principles, and that we stick to these principles, not only internally, but also in the way we defend vocally them outside the EU. And then I think there is a fourth one, and that is we can help by a policy of what I would call stability and a quiet hand. We have to accept, and that's more towards us than towards Ukraine, that the changes to come are not an issue of 2 or 3 years. And we have to get out of what I call the romantic approach. There was a revolution and in 3 years the country will be different. Yes, there was a revolution, but now we are in the transition. And this is something that will take a very long time. And one has to just recall permanently that one is ready to go that way in a stable manner together.